It's a bustling weekday morning in the heart of the city. The streets pulse with the sounds of honking horns, hurried footsteps, and scattered conversations. Office workers in crisp suits and polished shoes dart into towering glass buildings, clutching coffees and briefcases. Amid this urban rush, an elderly woman named Miss Ethel shuffles slowly along the sidewalk. Her movements are careful, weighted by years of memories. A small frame wrapped in a faded floral dress and a weathered cardigan, she clutches a well-loved purse against her chest. The leather is cracked, the straps worn, the zipper barely holding together. Her face is a landscape of wrinkles, telling stories of resilience and quiet strength. Kind eyes today carry a hint of worry. She pauses briefly by a bakery, catching the aroma of fresh bread. A soft, nostalgic smile crosses her lips, but she doesn't linger. There's something more important waiting. Ms. Ethel is a retired schoolteacher who spent decades shaping young minds. Her life was modest, never chasing luxury or excess. With her late husband, George, she had always been careful with finances, saving methodically and setting aside money in a small bank account they opened together when they first married. That account had remained untouched for years, a nest egg for emergencies, a symbol of their shared dreams. After George passed away, Ms. Ethel struggled to make ends meet. Rising costs and a fixed income meant every penny mattered. Last week, an official letter from the bank arrived, bringing troubling news. The letter claimed her account was at risk of being closed due to inactivity. The funds she and George had worked so hard to save could be absorbed by the bank if she didn't verify her identity in person. The thought of losing that money, her only safety net, had kept her awake for nights. Today, she was resolute. She would face this challenge head-on. The bank stood as a large, imposing building with shiny glass doors and a sleek marble exterior. The city's hustle seemed to fade as she paused at the entrance, gathering her courage. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached for the door handle. Determination etched across her face. Inside, the bank was a stark contrast to her world. Polished floors gleamed, walls were lined with modern artwork, and staff moved with clipped, professional efficiency. Customers in expensive suits tapped on phones or glanced impatiently at watches. Miss Ethel stepped inside cautiously, her sensible shoes squeaking against the marble floor. Nervousness and resolve battled in her expression as she clutched the letter and approached the reception desk. The woman behind the counter offered a polite but distant smile, fingers continuing to type on her keyboard. Softly but steadily, Ms. Ethel explained her purpose. She unfolded the letter with the precision of someone who treasures even the smallest things. The receptionist nodded and directed her to the customer service line, a long row of numbered windows filled with impatient customers. The line was intimidating. People stood with crossed arms, tapping feet, scrolling through phones. Ms. Ethel took her place at the end, shifting her weight, adjusting her purse straps, glancing nervously at the tellers. When her turn finally came, she approached the counter carefully. The teller barely looked up, eyes fixed on his computer screen. She explained her situation, polite, hopeful. She spoke of the account shared with her late husband, her long-standing trust in the bank, her desperate need for help. The teller's response was curt and dismissive. When he asked for identification, Miss Ethel hesitated. Her ID had expired, and traveling to the DMV to renew it had been challenging. Her voice grew quieter as she explained her difficulties. The teller sighed and called over a supervisor. Miss Ethel gripped the counter, trying to maintain her composure as the supervisor approached. What followed was a brutal encounter of bureaucratic indifference. Despite her pleas, despite explaining that this money was her lifeline, the bank staff remained unmoved. Policies were policies. No valid ID meant no access to her account. When Miss Ethel continued to protest, security was called. 2 guards approached, their presence intimidating. "Ma'am," one said authoritatively, "you need to leave." Tears welled in her eyes as she looked around, hoping for someone, anyone, to intervene. But the other customers avoided her gaze, lost in their own worlds. Gently but firmly, the guards guided her out. "This isn't fair," she whispered. "This is my money." On the sidewalk, the city's noise suddenly felt harsher. Ms. Ethel stood momentarily, clutching her purse and the crumpled letter, her shoulders sagging under the weight of humiliation and despair. A world moving too fast to notice had just pushed aside one of its most vulnerable members. Miss Ethel stands outside the bank, her small figure almost lost amidst the towering buildings and the sea of people bustling around her. Her face is lined with exhaustion and defeat, and she clutches her purse tightly as if it's the last anchor to her dignity. She looks down at the crumpled letter in her hand, her lips trembling as she tries to compose herself. A sleek black SUV pulls up to the curb in front of the bank. Out steps Shaquille O'Neal, over 7 feet tall, dressed casually but impeccably in a fitted jacket and jeans, with sunglasses perched on his face. As he surveys the scene, his gaze falls on Miss Ethel. Something about her small, hunched frame and the way she clutches her belongings catches his eye. Miss Ethel doesn't notice him at first. She's too lost in her own thoughts, her focus on the ground in front of her. But then, a shadow falls over her, and she looks up slowly. Her eyes widen slightly as she takes in the man standing before her. Shaq removes his sunglasses and crouches down slightly to meet her eye level. His expression is warm and gentle, a stark contrast to his imposing stature. He greets her with a smile and a simple, "Hello, ma'am. Are you okay?" Miss Ethel hesitates, unsure of how to respond. She blinks up at him, as if trying to process the moment. Finally, she shakes her head slightly and says, "I'm fine, thank you." Her voice is soft, but it carries a note of vulnerability. He studies her for a moment, then asks, "Were you in there just now? Did something happen?" She hesitates again, clearly reluctant to burden a stranger with her troubles. But there's something about Shaq's presence, his genuine concern, his kindness, that makes her feel safe. She nods slowly and explains, in halting words, what happened. As she speaks, Shaq listens intently, his expression growing more serious. When she describes how the bank staff treated her, his brows furrow slightly, and his jaw tightens. "That doesn't sound right," he says firmly, his deep voice carrying a note of quiet determination. "You shouldn't have been treated like that." Miss Ethel shrugs lightly, as if trying to dismiss the situation. "It's just the way things are," she says softly, her tone tinged with resignation. Shaq straightens up, his towering figure casting a protective shadow over her. "No, ma'am," he says firmly. "That's not how it should be. Not on my watch." He extends his hand toward her, a gesture of support and reassurance. "Come with me," he says. "Let's fix this." Miss Ethel looks at his outstretched hand, then up at his face. There's a moment of hesitation, but then she nods, a flicker of hope appearing in her eyes. She places her small, trembling hand in his, and he helps her to her feet. As they enter the bank, the atmosphere shifts instantly. Conversations hush, heads turn, and the room seems to collectively hold its breath. Shaq moves with quiet authority, his gaze scanning the room until he spots the teller and supervisor who had dismissed Miss Ethel earlier. He walks toward the counter, Miss Ethel at his side. The teller's eyes widen slightly as he recognizes the NBA legend, and the supervisor straightens his tie nervously. Shaq stops in front of the counter and places his hands on it, leaning forward slightly. "We need to talk," he says, his tone calm but firm. The teller stammers, trying to form a response, while the supervisor quickly steps forward. "Mr. O'Neal," he says, forcing a smile, "how can we assist you today?" Shaq doesn't respond right away. He glances down at Miss Ethel, then back at the supervisor. "I'm here with this lady," he says, gesturing toward her. "She came to you for help, and you turned her away. Now we're going to fix that." The supervisor nods quickly, signaling for the teller to assist Miss Ethel. The teller glances nervously at the supervisor, his hands trembling slightly as he types into his computer. He explains that the system requires a valid ID to verify her account, trying to justify the bank's policies. The supervisor cuts in. "Sir, we deeply apologize for any inconvenience this has caused. We'll do everything we can to resolve this matter immediately." Shaq looks at Miss Ethel, his gaze softening. Then he turns back to the supervisor, his deep voice steady and firm. "She's been a loyal customer of this bank for years," he says. "You've got all the information you need to verify her account. She shouldn't have to jump through hoops to access her own money." Turning to Ms. Ethel, he kneels slightly so he can speak to her at eye level. "Don't worry," he says. "We're going to make this right. You're not alone in this anymore." Ms. Ethel looks up at him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Her lips tremble as she tries to form words, but she only manages a small nod. The teller finally confirms the account details. "We have it here," he says. "The account is active, and the funds are intact." The supervisor, eager to appease Shaq, steps in again. "We'll waive any fees associated with the account," he says quickly. "And as a gesture of goodwill, we'd like to offer an additional service, perhaps a consultation to ensure everything is in order, moving forward." Shaq straightens up, crossing his arms over his chest. "That's a start," he says, "but I want to make sure she gets the respect she deserves. This isn't just about fixing her account. It's about how you treat people. Every customer who walks through those doors deserves to be treated with dignity." The supervisor stammers out an agreement, promising to review their customer service policies. He turns to Ms. Ethel, his demeanor noticeably more respectful. "Ma'am," he says, his voice softer now, "we're truly sorry for how you were treated. Please let us know if there's anything else we can do for you." Ms. Ethel looks at him, her expression a mixture of relief and gratitude. "Thank you," she says. "I just want to access the money my husband and I saved. It means so much to me." The teller processes her request, handing her a receipt and confirming that her account is secure. Once everything is resolved, Shaq places a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You did great," he says with a warm smile. "You stood up for yourself, and now things are back on track." Miss Ethel looks up at him, her eyes shining with gratitude. "I couldn't have done it without you," she says softly. Shaq turns to the supervisor one last time. His tone remains firm but not unkind. "Remember this moment," he says. "You have the power to make someone's day better or worse. Choose wisely." As they step out into the sunlight, Miss Ethel's steps are steadier now, her head held a little higher. Shaq walks beside her, his presence radiating quiet strength, a simple act of kindness that changed everything. Outside the bank, the busy city hums around them, but for a moment, it feels like time has slowed. Miss Ethel stands on the sidewalk, clutching the receipt and the small sum of cash the teller had handed her. Her fingers tremble slightly, but this time it's not out of fear or frustration. It's relief. She looks up at Shaq, her expression softening into a genuine smile. For the first time all day, the lines of worry on her face seem to fade. "Thank you," she says, her voice steady now. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't shown up." Shaq shakes his head, his tone warm yet firm. "You didn't deserve what happened back there. No one does. I just made sure they saw that." He pauses, studying her for a moment. "But the real strength, that came from you. You stood your ground." Miss Ethel's eyes glisten with tears, but she quickly wipes them away with the corner of her sleeve. "I've always tried to handle things on my own," she says. "But today was too much." Shaq crouches slightly so he's at her level, his presence grounded and comforting. "It's okay to ask for help," he says. "We all need a little support sometimes. And you've got it now." A small crowd has gathered nearby, drawn by the sight of Shaquille O'Neal and the heartwarming interaction unfolding. Some people are recording on their phones, while others simply watch, their expressions a mix of admiration and awe. One of the onlookers, a young woman with a kind smile, steps forward hesitantly. She holds out a small bouquet of flowers she had just purchased from a nearby vendor. "Excuse me," she says softly. "I just wanted to say, you're an inspiration, both of you." She hands the flowers to Ms. Ethel, who accepts them with a surprised but grateful smile. The moment feels almost surreal. Strangers approach, offering kind words and small gestures of support. One man pulls out his wallet and discreetly slips a few bills into Miss Ethel's hand, saying, "For whatever you need, ma'am." She tries to refuse, but he insists, his tone gentle and sincere. Shaq watches all of this unfold, his expression thoughtful. He steps back slightly, letting Miss Ethel have her moment in the spotlight. The kindness spreading through the crowd seems contagious, a ripple effect of the compassion he showed inside the bank. As the crowd begins to disperse, Shaq looks at Miss Ethel again. "Do you have everything you need for now?" he asks. "Is there anything else I can help you with?" Miss Ethel shakes her head, clutching the flowers and cash close to her chest. "You've done more than enough," she says. "I can't thank you enough." Shaq nods, then pauses for a moment, as if considering something. "How far do you live from here?" he asks. "Do you have a way to get home?" She hesitates before admitting that she usually takes the bus, but wasn't sure if she'd have enough cash left after everything that happened today. Without missing a beat, Shaq smiles and gestures toward the sleek black SUV still parked at the curb. "Let me give you a ride," he says. "It's the least I can do." At first, Ms. Ethel protests, insisting that she doesn't want to trouble him any further, but Shaq gently places a hand on her shoulder, his tone lighthearted. "You're not getting rid of me that easily," he says with a grin. "Come on, let's make sure you get home safe." The camera captures them as they walk toward the vehicle. Shaq opens the door for Miss Ethel, helping her inside with the same care and respect he's shown her all along. Once they're both seated, the car pulls away, merging seamlessly into the city traffic. As they drive, the conversation between them becomes more personal. Miss Ethel shares snippets of her life, how she and her late husband had worked hard to save for their retirement, how she's been trying to manage on her own since he passed. Her voice is steady, but there's a hint of vulnerability that she allows to show now. Shaq listens intently, nodding occasionally and offering words of encouragement. He shares some of his own experiences, his tone warm and relatable. The connection between them feels genuine, a reminder of the shared humanity that transcends their vastly different lives. When they finally arrive at Miss Ethel's modest home, Shaq steps out of the car and helps her to the door. Before she goes inside, she turns to him one last time. "I'll never forget this," she says. "You've shown me kindness I didn't think I'd find today." Shaq smiles, his towering figure somehow emanating both strength and gentleness. "Just promise me one thing," he says. "Don't ever let anyone make you feel small again. You're stronger than you think." Miss Ethel nods, her smile widening. She steps inside, the door closing behind her, but the camera lingers on Shaq for a moment longer. He stands on the porch looking thoughtful before turning and walking back to the SUV.